Okay, we're here today to talk about our last estuarine community, and that is mangrove forests. And again, I know I say this all the time, but mangrove forests are truly one of my most favorite estuarine communities. In the fact that these large trees have found a way to grow and thrive in this estuarine mud that's anoxic and, again, a toxic environment for many other plants. They simply can't survive there. And here, these large trees have found a way. So hopefully by the end of this, you will appreciate mangrove forests as much as I do. And I have to credit Dr. John Wesser, who teaches at Scottsdale Community College, for many of these images. He actually took many of these images when he went to visit a mangrove forest in Australia and then donated them for these presentations. Okay, so mangroves, if you remember, are going to be found in the tropical and subtropical regions of the world. So this is going to replace our salt marshes. Remember, we have our salt marshes in the temperate and the subarctic regions, and then our mangroves, okay, are going to replace those salt marshes in our tropical and our subtropical regions of the world. So again, their main distribution for mangrove trees is really primarily determined by temperature. They require those warmer temperatures, the tropical temperatures, to thrive. So again, these are the tropical equivalents of our salt marsh communities for estuaries. And again, they have found a way to grow in this sticky anoxic mud, which is pretty amazing. And they're well protected, okay, in this intertidal environment. And obviously, they do require some fresh water for growth. So we're going to talk about the adaptations that mangrove trees have for that. And then again, our mangrove forests are, of course, dominated by this dominant species of mangrove trees. Now, there are many different species of mangrove trees, depending upon where you are in the world. But they're all going to have very similar adaptations. And so we're going to talk about these adaptations as we go through the lecture. But these guys are a flowering land plant that, again, has found a way to adapt to intertidal life. So they're just pretty amazing. So this is a cool image of when the tide is out. So you can see here, the mud flats are going to be exposed, just like we talked about in the salt marsh community. Again, you have the ocean out here, and then you're going to have your mud flats. And then as you go farther inland is where you're going to have your mangroves. So your mangrove trees here are replacing those salt marsh plants. So here you can see the mud flats are exposed at low tide. And then at high tide, you can see the mud flats here are completely covered by water here. So coping with sticky, salty, smelly mud. How is it that mangrove trees have found a way to deal with this sticky, anoxic mud that's full of hydrogen sulfide just a few centimeters down in the soil? And so they have a couple things that they have to really deal with, that they have to have adaptations for. And that one of them is obtaining fresh water from salt water. How are they able to do that? And then two, the second thing we're going to talk about is how are they able to obtain oxygen from this anoxic mud? So first we're going to talk about how are they able to obtain fresh water from salt water. And there are kind of four major adaptations or strategies that mangrove trees will use. And again, different species of mangroves will use different adaptations or different strategies for dealing with the salt. So one way is simply just to be a salt excluder. So that means that typically the roots of these mangrove trees have a special membrane around them that actually prevents salt from ever entering their roots. A second way is to be a salt excreter. And this is where literally they have these salt glands that will actually excrete or pass out that excess salt from that brackish water or salt water. and they'll release those through these pores in the leaves. So they literally kind of sweat salt, if you want to think of it that way. And so again, that's another strategy, is just to simply excrete salt. So they're taking in the salt water and then they're just getting rid of that extra salt. Some of them are called salt accumulators, and they're actually just adapted to live with very salty sap. The xylem within them, which is the xylem is the cells of the plant that are carrying water, and those cells are just adapted to live in saline conditions. So again, their cells are adapted to handle that. We call these guys salt accumulators. And then some of them simply store salt in their leaves. So they'll still be a salt accumulator. They store salt in their leaves, but then they actually lose their leaves. So they lose the salt leaves. When the mangrove loses its leaves, it loses that salt and then kind of restores the balance. So those are the 4 main ways or adaptations for dealing with saline conditions as a mangrove tree. I'm just going to show you some pictures of these different mangrove trees. So again, here is a species of mangrove tree that produces the salt leaves. So again, they're going to accumulate the salt within their leaves, and then eventually they'll just drop these leaves, and with it, they're going to drop the salt. So that's one way, is to accumulate the salt, but within a certain part of the plant. And in this case, it's the leaves, salt leaves, and then you drop those leaves. Again, these are the salt excretors. So here you can see they actually have these specialized glands here, and you can see this one's actually secreting some of the salt here. And these specialized glands, again, will secrete the salt, and then the salt will be excreted through these pores on the surface. Here's one of the pores on the surface of the leaf, and that's its way of getting rid of the salt, excreting the salt. And that way, then the internal salinity concentration is much lower in the phloem and the xylem of the plant, so inside the cells of the plant. So those are some main ways that mangrove plants are actually able to handle the salt. Now, they also have to have adaptations for dealing with the fact that the soil has very little oxygen, right? And so what happens is mangroves are typically broadly rooted. What that means is they have, instead of having deep roots, they're going to have these roots that spread out more horizontally, okay? So again, instead of having, a deep root like we see in many of our plants here, that go, oops, I don't know what happened to my pen color here, but many of our plants here have roots that go quite deep in an attempt to look for water, right? Let's see, let me switch my pen color. I thought I had red here. I'm not sure why it's not showing up. So many of our plants have these really deep roots. Now here in mangrove communities, the roots don't want to go deep because remember, just a couple centimeters down, that soil becomes really anoxic. So instead, they're going to have these really broad roots that are going to really extend out. Oops, I'm drawing off my screen there. So they're really going to extend outward. And that'll be one of the big differences. So again, that's one of the ways that they're adapted to deal with that anoxic soil, is simply just not to grow down into that anoxic soil. And then many of the underground roots are also going to have projections that come back up into the air to be able to gather oxygen in the air. And we'll talk about these called pneumatophores. Okay, so those are some of the adaptations, and I'll show you some images of these so that you can see these as well. So these are called the pneumatophores. So these are these root projections that come back up above the ground to be able to absorb some oxygen. So that's one adaptation. You can see some of them, again, you'll see these big, vast areas in between mangroves that are just filled with these pneumatophores. So again, these are just little extensions of the roots that go above the surface or substrate to permit what we call aeration, allow for more oxygen absorption. So again, pneumatophores, just as a hint in terms of, you guys, probably many of you know this, but pneumo means air. So pneumatophores will help you remember that these are the parts of the roots that are coming above ground to grab oxygen for oxygen absorption. So pneumatophores. And then, so you can see here, these are these really broad roots that I was talking about. Again, really growing out horizontally instead of growing down in depth. So, and these roots kind of help to anchor when they grow out really broadly, help to anchor the tree as well. But we'll talk about another type of root that works for these plants to really help hold them in place because their roots are often pretty shallow. And so again, here's those pneumatophores sticking out. And the root types, the leaves, the fruits, and the seedlings of a mangrove are going to vary from species to species, but they have these main kind of similarities in terms of, you know, just the kind of having this basic anatomy of a tree. These broad roots, their stem, again, the leaves, and then we'll talk about these propagule seedlings in just a minute. So how do tall mangrove trees stay upright if their roots are really shallow, right? That becomes a really big challenge. And of course, mangrove trees have evolved and adapted a way to deal with that. And that is by having these roots called prop roots. This is easy to remember because the prop roots literally prop the tree up. So, and these are these like modified roots that are gonna extend from midway from the trunk of the mangrove tree. And they're going to grow down to provide extra support and literally prop the tree up. So let me show you what these are some of these prop roots. And you can see they get quite large, especially in these really established mangrove forests, because again, they are a network of these, you know, roots that are extending out from the stem to hold the tree upright in place. So, and we'll talk about then these prop roots as the tide comes in become points of attachment, a place for many of your sessile benthic organisms to actually attach, which is pretty cool. So again, now we're going to talk about the growth of mangrove forests and how they do reproduction. So nearly all mangroves share kind of two major reproductive strategies. And the first one is kind of a really unique thing because not a ton of trees do this. This is called vivipary. They have this, what's called uninterrupted development of the embryo following fertilization. So there's no real resting or true seed stage. They have this, the individual bait, right? The embryo that's going to start to develop while it's on the plant. And this is what we're going to call a propagule in just a minute. And then these propagules can be dispersed by water or they can simply spear into the mud. And I'll show you that in just a minute. So we're going to use the red mangroves called Rhizophora as our model. Again, you don't really have to know the different types of mangrove trees. I just let you know that. So this is what's called a propagule. And it's what we would think of as kind of the mangrove seed or seedling. That's going to continue to grow again, it's attached to the parent tree. And so that propagule will begin to grow while it's still attached to the parent tree. And this allows this new mangrove plant that's developing to store up food in case it's ever dropped at high tide and it's going to be pulled out with the tides and then has to make its way back in. It's spear-shaped so that if it does drop at low tide, it has the ability to stick in the mud. And then it floats in case at high tide it's dropped, and then it can again float in and out with the tides. So these are the propagules. You can see them growing off of the parent plant here. And again, they're very spear-like. And again, if they fall while the tide's out, they literally can spear into the mud, and then they'll very quickly grow out roots and shoots and develop into a new mangrove tree. So here you can see this one's putting out a shoot here, and then this one's just a little bit farther along. And then not before long, you now have leaves and an established root system. And just within a couple days, these mangrove trees will be very established. And again, partly what allows that is the fact that they've stored up all of this food in the propagule as they were continuing to develop on that parent plant. So pretty cool adaptation to be able, again, these are, again, pretty well established now mangrove trees. And so now we're going to get into what are kind of some of the ecological benefits to mangrove trees, because mangrove forests are unique as an estuarine community. And the reason that they become really unique and the reason that they are really our most diverse, biodiverse of our estuarine communities is that they're actually able to support both epifauna and infauna. So look at all these prop roots, right? All of these prop roots here are going to provide a place for epifauna to attach to. But then you also have that nice mud, right, at the base of this that provides a home for infauna. Also, all of these prop roots are great, again, for forming these nurseries as the tide comes in, because they're going to provide shelter and a place to hide for many of your juvenile fish and your juvenile shellfish. So again, mangroves become a great nursery, as do, again, most estuaries are great nurseries for many of our commercially valuable fish. So again, mangrove forests have some really important features. And one is that they actually have pretty high primary productivity for an estuary. And that's because we have these large mangrove trees, right? Okay, so these really large primary producers. And those trees are actually going to provide a home for many of your land terrestrial species. You actually even have some specialists, like you probably saw in the video that you had to watch for lab, like the proboscis monkeys, that are specialists on the mangrove leaves. So you have, again, in terms of biodiversity, we're now not just talking about the marine organisms, but also the terrestrial organisms, the birds that are living in the trees. Again, some of the terrestrial animals that are moving into these habitats, especially when the tide is low, to come feed. So again, really, really productive habitats. They have a high supply of, again, organic matter detritus, especially because they constantly have leaves falling. And these leaves fall, and then they're breaking down in that mud and providing more organic matter for that mud. And then, again, there are different types of mangrove species. And then we're not going to get into the zonation of mangroves just because it's a little more than we have time to get into. But if you want to read about it, again, there are kind of zones of different mangrove species. You also will find different mangrove species, again, in different places around the world. In Florida is known for its red mangroves if you're down in Florida. And the roots and stems, again, now are going to support these sessile epifauna marine invertebrates. So now you have epifauna in this estuarine, a lot of epifauna in this estuarine environment. So I'm just going to show you here. If you look closely on the stem of this tree, I know it's not a great picture, but you can actually see all of these little things that look like they're studding out from the stem. Those are all barnacles. So again, barnacles can actually attach not only to the prop roots themselves, all these prop roots, but then they can actually attach to the stems itself. So here you can see a close-up of all of these barnacles now attached to the actual stem of the tree. And then you can see again, of course, that's going to attract snails, predatory snails that will feed on these barnacles as well. So you again are going to have terrestrial species in your mangroves as well. So remember that we have all of these marine species, but we also have terrestrial species as well. So we'll have, along with our marine species of snails, right, we'll actually have some terrestrial snails or gastropods as well. Also, we have insects now that are going to inhabit the mangrove trees themselves. So you have things like grasshoppers and things like wasps. And again, many of your insects that you would find in a normal tropical forest. One of my favorites is the mud skippers, and I know you saw the mud skippers in the video for lab, but they truly are one of my favorites. And these guys are found primarily in your mangrove communities, mostly in the mud flats in front of the mangroves there, in your Indo-West Pacific mangrove forest. And again, as you guys know, these guys will burrow in the mud, and then at low tide, they have these modified pectoral fins that allow them to kind of move around. They look like they're kind of walking on land, and they'll end up kind of damming up these little mud areas where they kind of can hold water. They kind of create their own little tide pools. And then they'll go out and they'll catch insects and feed on smaller crabs. And then they can go back into their little tide pool that they had created with a mud dam. And again, these guys have these really large eyes. You'll see they're adapted to actually be able to see in the air. And then they'll actually retract them back in when they blink. You probably saw them do this in the video, into these moist pockets to keep them from drying out. So these guys are really well adapted to deal with life on land, as well as life in the water. The other thing is these guys are pretty cool. They can actually do a gas exchange, oxygen absorption across their skin. So that's one of the ways so they can stay out of the water for a little bit and feed on some of those terrestrial species and then pop back in and use their gills. Again, mangroves, as you probably know, especially in Australia, are also places where you can find some larger predators. So again, you'll have your land predators, but also you can find some larger marine predators, and these are your saltwater crocs. So of course, we'll talk about saltwater crocs when we get to marine reptiles. Okay, so lastly, in this lecture, we're going to talk about the ecological value of mangroves, and then we're also going to talk, of course, about the human impacts. So again, mangroves are this really incredibly diverse habitat because it supports our epifauna and our infauna. So you see things like seaweeds and sponges and oysters and sea anemones, barnacles, sea squirts, and many other types of organisms that you would find in both your rocky shore habitats as well as in your mudflats. So again, you get this kind of mix of both worlds, and this really ends up making a mangrove forest to be this incredibly diverse habitat. And then, of course, on top of that, then you have all of the terrestrial species, right? So you have terrestrial species that are living in the mangrove trees themselves or surrounding the mangroves, and will move in, things even like raccoons that will move in to feed during low tide. So as in temperate mudflats, burrowing fiddler crabs are really important here as well, and you'll see them quite readily, especially, again, if you're out in the mudflats, you'll see them, but you'll also see them surrounding the mangrove trees themselves, and they're really important for burrowing in and helping oxygenate the sediment. So again, they're one of those bioturbators. Some crabs themselves are specialists and will actually feed on mangrove leaves, which you saw in the video, and the muddy bottom, of course, is going to attract all kinds of deposit feeders. So things like polychaete worms, your mud shrimps, your clams, many of the same things that we talked about in terms of species that you find on your mud flats. And of course, then we already talked about those lovely prop roots of the mangroves really provide, again, a safe place for many of these larval species. So they are nurseries for many commercially valuable species of shrimp, spiny lobsters, crab, fish. And then on top of that, mangrove forests, because they're in tropical and subtropical communities, they, again, oftentimes will lead into the subtidal communities that are going to be your coral reef communities. And so many of your coral reef fish will actually use mangroves as nurseries as well. So not only are they nurseries for all of these commercially valuable species, but they're also nurseries for many of the species that live in our coral reefs themselves. And we'll talk about, again, kind of why this is. We're going to talk about subtidal communities are coming next. Remember that mangroves, all these estuarine communities, rocky shore communities are intertidal communities. Then farther below that, as you transition into the ocean, we're going to get into our subtidal communities. And we'll talk about the subtidal communities of your more temperate regions are going to be things like your kelp forests, and even some of your seagrass beds. And then as you get into your tropical communities, then your subtidal communities are going to be coral reef. So again, you can see that mangroves, being that they're a tropical, subtropical community, would then provide a great nursery for those subtidal communities out of your coral reef fish. So, and again, they're home, as we talked about, to many land species. So you're talking birds, snakes, lizards, again, saltwater crocodiles, bats, other land mammals that are going to be in there. So deer and, raccoons. So again, that's what makes these habitats so incredibly diverse. Mangroves are just really unique. And so what's the value, of course, to humans for mangroves? And they actually contribute really significant portions of the economy to some of these developing nations. So many of these developing nations are relying on them as fishery resources. They're relying on them for timber, although, of course, this can become a human impact in terms of whether or not they're doing this correctly or not. If they're just like clear cutting, your mangrove forest, this can become a threat. But, again, really many developing nations don't want to do that because they rely on these mangroves for other things. So again, fishery resources, sometimes charcoal, they're able to harvest from these mangroves, as well as they provide really great places for tourism. So those are some of the economic impacts. Obviously, again, they are like your coastal wetland communities that we talked about with salt marsh plants. They are going to serve as this big filter, right? So it helps to improve water quality as the water seeps down through the mangrove roots and through the sediment. Then it's going to help to remove all the bacteria and things like that in that sediment. Will help to remove pollutants and some of the particulate matter. And that literally acts as this big filter for water as it moves through there. And then, of course, there are many reasons at which to keep mangrove forests in terms of helping to protect our coastlines. So those mangrove forests really help to protect our coastlines from wave action, rising sea levels, from hurricanes. And so I want to show you a quick demonstration on this. This is pretty cool. It's from the Nature Conservancy did this demo. And this, you can go to this. I have this as an extra resource for you. You can go to this site and you can read about, again, the importance of mangroves. I know I kind of talk a lot about it, but this was great. They have this demonstration to show you how mangrove forests will actually protect these inland communities from wave action, especially from things like hurricanes. So you can see here the waves coming through here. And again, these mangrove forests are acting as a buffer for these inland communities. And so much so, they act so much like a buffer that there's actually some evidence that the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami wouldn't have actually been nearly as severe if mangrove forests had not been cleared in some of those areas. So please time to read the Human Impacts on Estuarine Communities section 12.4. I know I don't specifically always ask you, read this. So usually, again, I know you're skimming the chapters, but when I put reading exercises on there, please take the time to really read those. I want you to really read through all of the human impacts of estuarine communities and to really understand how, again, valuable they are. And then I have a short video for you here, of course, on mangroves. So the Smithsonian, again, it's
Imagine a coastline in the tropics or subtropics. What comes to mind is a coral reef and probably a sandy beach. But nearby, there's another ecosystem that's often overlooked, yet may be even more important to the health of the whole area. It's called a mangrove forest. Mangroves are trees and shrubs that cluster along coastlines, including bays, lagoons, and inlets. Living in or adjacent to the intertidal zone, they straddle two worlds. Here, the daily rhythm of the tides sets the pace. This ritual exposes the intricate roots of the red mangroves, which live closest to shore. It's easy to see why they've earned the nickname walking trees.
So those
The harsh conditions of the waves and salty water would kill most ordinary plants in a few hours. Yet the mangroves not only adapt, they create a sanctuary. An extraordinary range of creatures live in a mangrove forest. Some stay here full time. Others come to spawn. 3/4 of all tropical fish are born here. Beautiful and delicate organisms seek refuge. Countless reptiles and birds call these forests home. Other ecosystems nearby, like coral reefs, also depend on mangroves. They filter nutrients and toxins out of the water, improving water quality. Their dense, intertwining roots also provide protection and shelter during extreme weather. When storms, hurricanes, and tsunamis strike, it's mangrove forests that help reduce flooding and coastal erosion. Nothing made by man does it better. We've had to learn this lesson the hard way, because in the last 50 years, the world has lost more than 1/3 of its mangrove forests. We've cleared them for coastal development, aquaculture, and lumber. Tragically, we've underestimated the value of this quiet, unflashy forest that turned out to be one of the most productive ecosystems on the planet. But it's not too late. We can still save our remaining mangrove forests and reclaim land for more. This vital ecosystem deserves our respect, and so do the creatures that call it home.
Okay, so again, many of your, I didn't put a separate slide here, specifically the threats to mangroves, because the threats to mangroves are the same as the threats to estuarine communities. Again, you can read about these human impacts again, but they're going to be those same types of threats in terms of, you know, turning, clear-cutting mangroves, using, this time, the only difference is that we can use the trees for timber, and then, you know, using those areas to make marinas, using those areas for development, again, turning those areas into aquaculture, fish farming, or, you know, mariculture, sometimes doing farming of shellfish. And then, so again, those impacts to estuarine communities, unfortunately, are going to be the same big, long list of human impacts that we have to estuarine communities in the last lecture. And then this is John Wesser. He's the one that took the images, so I, of course, have to give him credit for these lovely images of the mangrove forest. All right, so I will see you back for the next set of lectures which will actually be on subtidal community. So this will be this is our last intertidal community lecture, and then we'll get into subtidal communities, which will be kelp forests, seagrasses, and then coral reef communities. And then after that, we're on to fish, marine reptiles, and marine mammals, and that's it. All right, guys. So please let me know, as always, if you have any questions.